So what's up? It's Alex, and in this video, we're going to talk about how EQ works and why it's so important as a tool in your arsenal as a mixing engineer. So as a mixing processor, EQ, which is short for equalization, is one of the most important tools to actually achieve separation and balance amongst your instruments in the mix. So when you use cuts and filters, you effectively carve away parts of the frequency spectrum for specific instruments to create more room in your mix and to eliminate any unnecessary frequency information. So you can kind of think about it like a sculptor using a chisel. You have this giant block of marble and you're going to be chipping away parts of that marble until something beautiful emerges from your imagination. On the flip side of that, you can also add warmth and presence to a sound by boosting specific parts of the frequency spectrum and accentuating some of its more attractive qualities. So you can think of that as a painter adding new layers and new textures to a painting to accentuate its vibrancy, right? You could add gradients of color and new textures to make something simple a lot more vibrant. And weirdly enough, with EQ, sometimes you can add warmth and presence by taking away frequencies. All right, so if we zoom out and look at EQ from an overarching view, you can kind of look at this kind of like a historian trying to fill a museum with specific and significant pieces of art to represent different ages, different time spans, different styles. So in this process of selecting this art, you're going to have to accentuate the characteristics that display a certain style, and you're going to have to remove the things that might be a little bit muddy, that might not clearly display what you're trying to showcase in your museum. All right, and speaking about art, EQ itself is an art form, all right? There are so many different ways to go about it, and if you use EQ creatively, you can make a mix that sounds like a wet dog, sounds super powerful and punchy. And depending on your EQ choices, you will severely change the sound and the feel of a song. So at the end of the day, it really comes down to your ear and your personal preference. But in the long run, if you can follow some simple guidelines and strategies, you'll be better able to develop yourself as an EQ artist in your mixing endeavors. All right, and that is the whole goal with these videos. So why is EQ so important anyways? And the best way to start off with this is to actually break down what an EQ is and how it works, because in understanding the tool, you'll better be able to see its application and use it. All right, because there's nothing more frustrating than trying to use a tool that you don't understand. So together, we're going to understand everything you need to know about EQ, the different frequency spectrums, the audio jargon, and you're going to be an EQ pro. All right, so we're going to cover the fundamentals of EQ before diving into some more advanced EQ strategies. We're going to cover some of the audio jargon, the common lingo, the language around certain frequency spectrums, and then we're going to fit it all together, bring it all together in some real world examples of using EQ in various different situations. All right, before we get started, I want you to understand one super important thing, and that is that EQ is present in every part of the recording and mixing phase. All right, so when we record, whether it's a vocal part, a guitar amp, or something else, and we're using a microphone with a built-in frequency response, we're effectively using the principles of EQ to actually choose and find the sound that sounds the best to our ears. When we mix all of our tracks and our sounds together, whether we're trying to achieve a giant wall of sound or we're trying to achieve separation amongst all the parts in your song, we're using EQ. When we use saturation to enhance the harmonics of a sound, we use EQ to tame that down and to reduce the harshness. When we want to increase the overall volume and impact of our mix by cutting away unnecessary frequency information, we're using EQ. So all that said, think of your EQ as a trusty lightsaber on your journey to growing as a mixing engineer, because you might pick up more tricks, techniques, and tips along the way, but at the end of the day, you will always have that trusty lightsaber with you. All right, so now let's focus on how an EQ actually works. So there's only actually 3 controls that you have to know about to effectively utilize an EQ. And I'm gonna show you how those controls work with this awesome looking Audio Issues EQ that we have here. So the first control that you have to be aware of with an EQ is called frequency. All right, so you'll see that in this graph here, we have a representation of the whole frequency spectrum that humans typically interact with. And the common range that you'll see is from 20 Hertz to 20,000 Hertz or 20 kilohertz. And just for your information, frequencies are measured in cycles per second, which are also called hertz. All right, so low frequencies have less cycles per second and higher frequencies have higher cycles per second, or hertz or frequencies. So the lower the pitch that you're working with, the less cycles per second or the lower frequency it will have. And the opposite is also true. The higher the pitch of the sound that you're working with, the higher the cycles per second, higher the frequency. All right, a good way to think about frequencies in an EQ is to picture a bunch of tiny volume faders. So a fader like this, picture a bunch of tiny ones all aligned on the frequency spectrum, all representing different frequencies. All right, and you can start making EQ moves depending on what frequency you select. All right, so the first control that you'll be adjusting in an EQ is the actual frequency selection. And the way you do that is by grabbing one of these nodes and moving it to the right to select higher and higher frequencies, or move it to the left to select lower and lower frequencies. And you'll notice that there's a little hertz number that is moving in conjunction with the movement of the node. All right, so the second control we're going to look at is what is called gain. And gain is what you use to actually affect the change to a specific frequency. So you'll either increase it or attenuate it, or what is often called boost and cutting frequencies. All right, so once I select a specific frequency, I can then use what is called the gain to either boost it or cut it. So for example, I'm going to take this node and I'm going to bring it to 2000 hertz or 2 kilohertz. And I can either move it up to boost it, or I can drag it down to cut it at that specific frequency. And keep in mind that you actually have to both select a frequency and either boost it or cut it to actually be EQing the sound. If you just select a frequency, you're not actually EQing the sound at all. You either have to boost it or cut it using the gain control. And the third control of an EQ is what is called the Q, which stands for quantity factor, and sometimes it's referred to as the bandwidth. And what this actually means is if you're boosting or cutting a frequency, you can adjust how narrow or how wide the boost or the cut is. And in this plugin, you can simply scroll up or down to adjust how wide or how narrow your boost or cut is. So the Q control is super handy if you want to, for example, affect a broad range of frequencies. You can have a very wide Q, and alternatively, you can have a very narrow Q and pinpoint specific frequencies to boost or cut. All right, and a quick tip is that generally, as a rule of thumb, you'll want to boost with a very wide Q and you'll cut with a more narrow Q. All right, you want to think of subtractive EQ, which is basically cutting. You want to think of this like a scalpel. You're taking away frequencies you don't like, but you have to be careful not to cut the vitals of the instrument. Conversely, super narrow boosts sound very unnatural. For example, a 20 decibel boost with a very narrow Q will pinpoint that frequency and it will stick out like a sore thumb. So generally, you're going to want to use more broad boosts. All right, so now that we're familiar with the three main controls that you'll see with an EQ, let's dive into the three main methods that you will see in actually utilizing the EQ. All right, so I'm going to show you these three different methods using some sounds so we can actually see how the frequencies are affected by our EQ moves. So first and foremost, we're going to use some white noise. It is not the most fun thing to listen to. However, white noise creates frequencies in the entire frequency spectrum. So it's a great visual tool to demonstrate. So as you can see, when I play the white noise, I have this post analyzer enabled, so we can actually see all the frequencies that are being generated by this white noise in the EQ plugin. So on this plugin, if you hold Alt and click one of these last nodes, you will enable what is called a high pass filter or a low pass filter. And basically what a filter does is it completely removes the frequencies above or below a certain point. And this is a super powerful tool to use to remove any frequencies that are either unnecessary or just noisy or just something you don't like about whatever sound you're EQing. All right, so if we, for example, turn on the low pass filter, it's going to allow the low frequencies to pass through while cutting out the high end. So let's give that a go. Play the white noise. Let's bring this down. So notice that as I bring this low pass filter down, it's only allowing the low frequencies to pass through. And if I bring it back up, it's slowly allowing the high frequencies to come back. And you can click in this top right-hand corner to adjust the intensity of the slope. So that's more of a chill slope, and that's more of a gradual slope. And this would be the most extreme slope. So the more extreme cutoff of the three options. All right, I'm gonna stop playback and I'm going to turn this off for now. And let's actually do that with the high pass filter, which lets the high frequencies pass through while filtering out the low end. So let's try that. Let's turn this one on. So notice how all the low frequencies got cut out, and now we're just getting that harsh high end sound. If I bring it back, all the low end frequencies come back. And again, you can change the slope with this drop down menu over here. Turn this off for now. All right, the second method we already touched on briefly is what is called cutting. And this is also called subtractive EQ. And you can use this to cut out any annoying sounds and to make room for other sounds in your mix. All right, so let's go ahead and cut out some frequencies of this white noise. You'll notice that I grabbed a node and I dragged it down. And depending what frequency I'm selecting, it's going to cut out those corresponding frequencies. All right, and you could do this with a very narrow cue if you wanted to really pinpoint a frequency, or you could do it with a broad if you wanted to generally take out frequencies. And then finally, the third method you can use while EQing is boosting. All right, and this is very handy to add something that's missing or to accentuate something that already sounds amazing. You just want to make it more present. So let's go ahead and try that with the white noise. So notice that as I'm boosting a specific part of the frequency spectrum, it creates a specific pitch. So that's how you would go about boosting certain frequencies with the EQ. One thing to keep in mind in terms of boosting or cutting frequencies is that there's two ways to do this with an EQ. The first one is what we just covered, which is called a bell-shaped curve. You can use these bell-shaped curves and adjust their cues to boost or cut. But what we also have is what are called shelves, and you can boost by shelving or cut by shelving. And what a shelf does is it increases or decreases everything above or below a certain point. So let me show you what that looks like. So this is what it would look like to boost the high end with a shelf. At the same time, this is what it would look like to cut the high end with a shelf. Same goes for the low end. We can boost the low end with a shelf, or we can cut the low end with a shelf. You can bring this in as much as you want and really play around with it that way. All right, so just to keep in mind, there's a difference between shelves and bell curves. All right, so let's quickly go over what we just covered in terms of the controls of an EQ and the methods in which you can control them with a more real life fun example. I have this loop that I've loaded. You'll notice that it has its own frequency content that we can see in the analyzer. And let's quickly go over what we covered. So if we select a node here, we can select the frequency that we want to affect by dragging it left to right on this spectrum. And then if we want to boost or cut, we can move this node upwards or downwards. If we move it up, we're going to be boosting frequencies. And if we bring it down, we're going to be cutting out frequencies. And then the final control is we can adjust the cue of this bell curve by scrolling, and we can do very narrow cuts and very narrow boosts. We also learned that we can filter out sounds. So if we turn on this high pass filter, we can drag this filter in and start filtering out the low frequencies. We can bring them back in. And we can also do the same thing with what is called a low pass filter. So let's turn this on. We can filter out all of the high frequencies or allow the low frequencies to pass. And then finally, we learned that there's a difference between utilizing a bell curve, such as this one, and using a shelf, such as a high boost shelf, a high cut shelf, or do the same thing in the low end. We can also do the shelf in the low end. All right, so I hope that helped clarify how to use an EQ and what it's about. And in the next video, we're going to dive deeper into investigating all the different frequency ranges.